Hello everyone, and welcome to part 2 in our series on ASP.NET Core. If you haven't watched part 1, then I have the link in the description. You can go take a look at that. In this part though, we are going to look at the download, install, and a very basic ASP.NET Core 2.0 application, and then we will put in some debug points and go through the code and see how it works. Alright, so the two ways you can get ASP.NET Core onto your machine is either through Visual Studio or through the website microsoft.com/net, this one here. And almost everyone is going to go through Visual Studio from what I have seen, but in case you want to do that, you would go here. One of the reasons you would go here is if you already had a previous version of .NET Core installed and you were bringing your machine up to date for ASP.NET Core 2.0, then you would have to go here and then update Visual Studio as well, so that they remain in sync. So I have the community edition. I downloaded that, installed it. It's a very simple setup. Just remember one thing: the setup time for Visual Studio is directly proportional to the number of packages that you select. For example, if you're selecting Xamarin and you're selecting .NET Core, then it is obviously going to take that much longer to install. Whereas if you're just selecting .NET Core, it's going to be much faster. And then the same goes for Windows 10 desktop application setup and all of those things, right? So you get Visual Studio, and then you come here, and then the one that I got was the 2.0 SDK. It's a very simple setup. All you got to do is download it, open the file, hit next, and it installs, right? The one thing that I should have shown in my previous video, which I forgot, is where do you go to see where the .NET Core framework actually exists on your machine? And that would be here inside your program files, .NET, and then SDK. So as you can see, I have various versions going back to the preview versions for ASP.NET Core and .NET Core that I have. So I have 1.0 preview 2, and then I have 1.0.4, 1.1.0, and now I just installed the 2.0. So with that said, let's go to Visual Studio. Let's create a new project. This screen, for some reason, is whatever it is. I mean, you can select on .NET Core, but you see it still shows .NET Framework 4.6.1. I don't even know why. But you can select ASP.NET Core. Let's give this one well, I can't think of anything else right now, so that's what it's going to be. And then let's click on OK. And now on this screen, you can select which ASP.NET Core version you want to target, and we want to target the ASP.NET Core 2.0. I'm going to select the MVC just because we have certain options that I wanted to go through, and then click on OK. Now this is going to go bootstrap the application, make all the necessary files that it needs to make, and when the solution is ready, essentially at that point you are all set to basically just debug and look at the application right away. So this line over here which says restore completed in 3 seconds, this is something that we're going to talk about right now. So ASP.NET Core, the way it works right now is these are you can consider them as a collection of packages. So these collection of packages put together along with the .NET Core framework is what makes your website run, right? So if you right click and say edit hello world.cs project, which you couldn't do previously, And if you come here, oh, I'm sorry, when I say you couldn't do it previously, I don't mean it's a 2.0 specific. It's been there for a long time, but you couldn't do that in back in the days when it was just MVC. It used to run with the system.web. This package here is a very interesting one. It's what the ASP.NET Core team calls a meta package. A meta package is wherein, so like I was saying, ASP.NET Core is a collection of packages, right? A meta package is nothing but what says, now you don't need to reference those separate packages, whereas when you build and you deploy your application, the system is going to look, or rather the framework is going to look at your application and only keep the references to the packages that are actually utilized in your app. But you don't have to go here and reference all the numerous packages that you're going to use, which is a very welcome change, because there were times when you would see a whole big list. I'll probably pull up a different application that I have in an older 1.0.4 or 1.1, and you can see it's a big list of references that you end up making, right? So this is really good, but this is from where you would go and you would say, okay, all the ASP.NET Core references are contained within this one reference of meta package microsoft.aspnetcore.all. The version number is obviously 2.0 because that's what we're using. And then program.cs. If you're new to the ASP.NET Core ecosystem right now, there are quite a few things that you need that would look different to you. One of them is that ASP.NET Core is essentially now just a console app, right? It has its own static void main, and that's where the system builds itself and runs from, right? It's a very simple concept. This is what it's called a build host, and this is where you configure the different things that your system needs to get up and running. The create default builder, this is again something that's new in 2.0. This is basically saying, hey, you know what, there are there's a collection of defaults that are needed to run a web app. Load those, and that's what that create default builder does. And then it uses the startup file, which we'll get to in a minute, and then builds the app, and now your app is ready to run. So let's look at the startup.cs file. This file is probably one of the most important files you will deal with when you're working on ASP.NET Core. This is the main configuration file, wherein you configure all your services, you configure all the features that you're using within the application, and this is basically bootstrapping your application, so to speak, right? So there are a couple of methods here that we will go over. One which is configure services, and another which is configure. Now, the main difference, right, is what and when these methods are called, right? So what we want to know is, okay, so when I'm running the app and someone goes to mysite.com, which one and how does it get run, right? So I think it's best if we just take a look with an example and see what happens. Now, because we had the NuGet packages just restored, it's not going to take a long time to restore and get the app up and running. Now you can see over here on the lower right hand side that the website is still running on IS Express, and I'll show you in a minute how it gets that information of where to run and how to run from IS Express. Okay, so well, we don't really need that right now. Let's put a breakpoint here. Let's put a breakpoint here, and then let's run. Oh, look at that. Nothing happened. Okay, let's stop our application and let's run it now. Let's see what happens now. Is there any different? Oh yes. So Now we hit configure services. Let's hit continue. And now we hit our use static files as well. That's interesting, right? Now hits continue and the page is up and running. Now if you go to any different pages, this is really interesting. These two don't get hit anymore. So that basically means that these methods are used to configure the web server, essentially a web server, and like the comment there says, it's called by the runtime, right? The first one, the configure services, takes in an iService collection, which is nothing but a bunch of services. It's a collection of services, right? And then you are adding your services onto that collection. You're saying I need MVC. Later on we might say I need authentication, right? Or I need my own service that I have written, right? Say for example your email service, your messaging service, your weather service, if that is what we want to make. But all those services that can be used throughout your application get configured here. The second method, which is our configure method, is used to construct the HTTP pipeline through which every request is going to go through, depending on how we have configured it, right? A good example of that is when someone goes and requests your page, what is actually happening, right? This window here, I think, is one of the best windows I have seen in a long time in Visual Studio, the output window. And this basically tells you a lot of information, right? So essentially it gives you logging information throughout the pipeline, and the aspnet core team has done a great job at having amazing logging built into the framework, and that is configured right here in your create default builder, right? Okay, so we will get to this concept of environment later on in the maybe in the next video. Okay, maybe we will get to the concept of environments in the next video that we will do, but essentially it's saying if the environment that the current application is running in is, if it's development, then put these in the pipeline. If it's not development, then put this in the pipeline, and then put this, and then put this, right? So the way it happens is when the request comes in, it's going to go through top to bottom and then back on its way out. Okay, now there's a little bit of technicality that you need to understand, that anyone in the pipeline has the capability to short circuit your HTTP pipeline. What that means is, say for example you request a CSS resource, right? The CSS resource could be handled by the use static files middleware. Each module that you see over here is what's called as a middleware, right? So the CSS, or like your images or your JavaScript files, your client-side JavaScript files, could be served by the use static files middleware, right? So the static file middleware could see the request coming in and say, hey, I know how to handle this request. So it handles the request and then just short circuits everything that is below the static files middleware and just says, you know what, I know this request, I know how to handle it, I have handled it, I don't need anyone else to process this, so I'm going to send back the response, right? At that point in time, the request never reaches the use MVC middleware, right? I think that's an amazing thing. I mean, the amount of it's just very neat way of doing it. Why make something go through a whole bunch of modules when you don't need to, right? When someone says, I know how to handle this thing, right? For example, use MVC is also a short circuit middleware. What that means, if you have an MVC request, static files middleware will say, I don't know how to handle this request, which then goes to the MVC middleware, and then the MVC middleware handles that request, processes it, and then sends the response back, right? We will also, in this course, be doing how to build our own middlewares, and then we will see how exactly as developers we can really see the advantages of what a middleware can do. So like we said for services, again for middleware, we could have middlewares that do authorization, that do authentication, middlewares that process certain kinds of API requests. Like for example, there is a middleware for generating your Swagger files for web APIs. So we will do all of that stuff as well. Okay, so the last part of this video that I want to show you is the very basic nature of the MVC middleware, right? For example, in the site that's running right now, it doesn't have any extension, right? So the request just went to localhost at root, right? Now, what happens when the request goes to localhost root? It goes through the same pipeline. Static file says, I don't know what I'm supposed to do with it. It passes it to the next middleware in the pipeline, which in our case happens to be the MVC middleware. Now, if you know anything about MVC middleware, you know what routes are, right? Routes is a mechanism of saying, read the URL, parse the URL, see where I'm supposed to send this URL, right? Where I'm supposed to send the request, rather, contained inside this URL. So you take that, and then you give it to MVC, and MVC over here says, oh, the default route, I have the controller's home and the action is index. This controller equals to home and action equals to index signifies that these are parameters with default values to it, right? It does not mean that they are optional parameters. It just means that they are parameters with some default values in it. So you definitely need to pass in some controller name. You need to pass in some action name, right? Whereas the third parameter in this sequence, which is the ID followed by a question mark, that signifies that that is an optional parameter, right? So when we have nothing and the request is just going to root, what that basically means is that it's going to be home and it's going to be index as the action with nothing supplied to the options, right? Which we can very well easily test here, right? So we could go to home, and definitely there is an index view over here, right? Again, these are following the same patterns for MVC that have existed before in the .NET framework, which have existed in all other frameworks, frankly. There is a controller, there is an action, and then there is a view associated with that controller and action. The views are all in the views folder. So you would go by the controller name and then the action name, right? And there you go. That's our code that we're seeing on this page right here. If you really want to test it out, more? Sure. Let's save this. Let's hit refresh. And there you go. That's our learn more. Sure. Right? Now, the reason I was able to edit this and then just see the response back is because I'm editing a razor page, right? So I could essentially even do this, or cdate equals to date time dot, no, let's just take now, right? And then going back here, we could just say at c date dot toString, short date string, and save this. Let's run this, and there you go. That's our date, right? Now this is all part of Razor. We will do this more in detail when we are going through MVC, but that's it for this tutorial. I will see you in the next video. Thank you.